So something I've noticed lately regarding a lot of franchises is a difference of nostalgia. Some people would like the original, some people like newer interpretations. But I think one recurring factor in all of this is most people don't really understand where the other person's coming from when they have all these arguments and discourse over the same franchise, basically. Like, they like the same franchise, and in a world where people are very different, like different things, you found someone who likes the same thing as you, they just happen to like a different era. I was going to give several examples of this trend lately. One particular one is the Pokemon franchise. Some people grew up with the original Generation 1, and some people grew up somewhere in between then and now. Quite a few people grew up with the Gen 3 games, which is the Hoenn region, and that would be their favourite game, and they won't really like what came before it too much. But then those who grew up with the original will look at the Hoenn games and be like, oh, what a load of crap. And some fans get really annoyed when their nostalgia isn't represented in the modern games. An example of this is in Pokemon Sword and Shield, Charizard was given like a G-Max form. He was the champion signature Pokemon. Additionally, all of the Gigantamax Pokemon were Generation 1 with the exception of one Generation 5 Pokemon, which is arguably one of the more controversial ones, which is Garbodor, the literal trash bag. Pile of rubbish. I'm personally a fan of Generation 2 the most, even though I did grow up on the original Generation 1. And I've played every game somewhat close to the launch, so I've got kind of a good appreciation for most of the games. And I think all of them have something to offer. Some aren't as good as others. I didn't really like the designs for Generation 3 and 4, but it's all personal taste at the end of the day. Another franchise where fans are divided by generation a bit is the Transformers franchise. You had the 1984 original cartoon, which came with the original toy line. That seems to be the sort of staple of the franchise, where everything all of the modern designs are somewhat based on the original Generation 1 versions, but some fans are a bit bitter because the one they grew up on, whether it's like Armada or Prime or some other one, isn't represented quite as much. Then you've also got Power Rangers, in which Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the one from 1993, the one that kind of kickstarted it and got really popular, that gets a lot of focus from Hasbro, who make a lot of merchandise based upon the original series. From what I've seen of the Lightning Collection, a lot of it is Mighty Morphin based, and some of the more recent series, or the ones from like 10 years ago, just don't really get the representation. And finally, you have the Star Wars franchise, which often goes back to the original trilogy. Now, you might be thinking, where is this going? You might be thinking, what's the point of this video? I want to help people kind of bridge that gap and understand each side a little more. Because I have looked into this a bit, and I've got my own experiences as well as others I've spoken to. So let's get right into it. Some could argue that the original series of a franchise is the source material. It's where everything kind of originates from, it's what got it on the map, it's the most important. I wouldn't really say it's the most important, though. I feel like every aspect has an importance, and each one has a different meaning to different people. I never watched the original Voltron from the 80s growing up, but I did watch the legendary Defender series a few years back, and that's the one I kind of know. But if they do a new iteration of Voltron, I'm going to assume they're going to lean more towards the 80s version than the legendary Defender remake. The nostalgia hit that some people would get from the 80s version will be lost on me. At the same time, I'd be perfectly okay with that. I do think, though, they should maybe include some nods to some of the offshoots. Like, if they're to completely ignore, what the franchise was for a few years, I'd see that as ignorant. Like, if Transformers never did anything to mention Transformers Animated ever again, I think a lot of fans might be unhappy, because that was one of the main series they were pushing for a few years. Even though it was alongside the movies, a lot of people resonated with that, and it was their childhood. Or the series just happened to really appeal to them, and it was just the thing that matched their personal taste the most. You also get the reverse, where newer fans will come into a franchise and be like, everything before the one I grew up in is terrible. It is the worst. It has not aged well. They had no personalities back before I existed. And I think that's just as bad. And by just as bad, I mean just as bad as those who hate the newer stuff and just want the original back. I think there has to be a balancing act. I think whenever a franchise lasts so long, they're going to have a very diverse set of fans because they've been going for so long. I think one thing newer fans should consider is how different media and technology was back long ago. I wasn't around for the 80s, but I was around for the 90s, and even back then, you wouldn't really be able to watch a full series as accessibly as you can now. You'd have like a VHS with maybe a couple of episodes, or you have no episodes available and occasionally might see one on TV or at a friend's house. Aside from that, you have your imagination, some toys, and what limited access to that media you can get. And from what I can tell, in the 80s, it was even more difficult to access media of different franchises, such as TV episodes and all that extra lore and all that you want. Like today, you can literally just do a Google search and you can be watching the entire series by the time you get to bed. There wasn't really too much technology back then either. Like, the internet didn't really become a mainstream thing in houses until the early 2000s anyway. A lot of kids would actually play outside, and Minecraft didn't exist, and YouTube didn't even exist, and everyone just used their imagination a far lot more. So whenever people say something like, Swindle in Generation 1 had no personality until he was brought into Transformers Animated. In Generation 1, he did have that episode, The Ultimate Weapon, which is actually my favourite Generation 1 episode. And it really did showcase his personality as this kind of scheming guy trying to... Because his name is Swindle, and he swindles, and he lies, and maybe back then cartoon writers didn't flesh out the characters quite as much because they were seen as more of toy adverts, but to some kids watching it back then, that would be like one of the few episodes they see on repeat. Swindle might be one of the few toys they had as well. As time moves on, we get faster access to anything we want, and it's almost like having Christmas every day. You could just type a few things on your computer and you're watching a series you really enjoy in full, like I said before. But back then, it was more of a luxury to do all of that. Again, I wasn't around for the 80s, but seeing the 90s and hearing stories of the 80s, kind of paints a good image of what it was like. And also I can see how it is now, where someone will just binge watch all the old series and just be like, oh, it's terrible, like it's not aged well. But I think unless you appreciate a product at the time it was released, you don't get the full grasp of how great it was for the time. Like, I wasn't around when the original trilogy of Star Wars was released. I like the films, but I would never know what it was like to experience them in the cinema at the time that they were released. Whenever the original Pokemon games came out, they were pretty ahead of the curve in terms of the fact you could have like 150 different Pokemon. You can catch a combination of 6 of them on your team and go for an entire journey with them. That hadn't really been done before, but then some newer fans will look back and like, oh, those games are just so old and the technology's limited, and the newer games did it so much better. And also, like, there was the whole craze of Pokemon where you had all these unique designs and suddenly mass marketing merchandise all around the globe. Everyone was crazy for them. There was never a franchise quite as big as Pokemon when the original games came out in the cartoon. Power Rangers has never had quite the mainstream success as it did from its original run. Star Wars had a massive resurgence during the prequel era, although a lot of fans hated it, but kids loved it. I'd also like to say that the cartoon era that Dave Filoni created, like the Clone Wars and all the other shows like that, kind of counts as its own era as well. I've always seen the cartoons as quite an undertaking. Couldn't really get into them myself, but I can appreciate how much people like them and how popular they are. Meanwhile, I feel like every era, generation of Star Wars can kind of almost agree that the Disney era trilogy, it wasn't good. And yeah, I'll just leave it there. I'm not going to go into that whole topic. So hopefully some of that gives the younger fans more of an idea of why older fans might like stuff they don't like, but older fans should really kind of appreciate how younger fans didn't grow up watching the original trilogy in the cinema. They didn't watch the G1 cartoon of Transformers growing up, nor did they have the toys, and they got access to Beast Wars, which in my opinion is a much better series anyway. Also, as time progresses on, people drop out of enjoying these the same. Some of the people I knew collecting Transformers when I was a kid, they don't collect them anymore. They probably sold off their collection. They'll probably smile if they hear the word Transformers and remember it, but they have no real kind of attachment to it the same anymore. Meanwhile, these newer fans coming into the franchise and these newer shows are what's kind of keeping it alive. Also, another fan of the series like yourself who you can talk to about it. I find people who have different takes on a franchise also offer different perspectives. You might find you didn't like something years ago, but if you watch it with someone who really enjoyed it themselves, or they talk to you after you watch it, you might kind of get a better appreciation of it. I think as fans of these different things, if we can just respect each other, respect that not everyone's going to have the same favourite series, or the series you hate might be the one they really enjoy. You need to find common ground rather than look for ways to kind of discredit what they like, because if they're really a passionate fan and you just constantly complain about what they like, they might not like that after a while. They might get sick of you. I've seen this happen quite a lot in different communities. Ultimately, if we can find a decent common ground of another fan, then we can get better enjoyment out of these things we enjoy. Wouldn't it be great if that series you hated, you actually found something you liked about it and it made you appreciate that franchise even more? I think we can learn a lot from each other no matter what our backgrounds are, no matter what generational divide there is. And hopefully this video has been able to give you guys some insight on a perspective you normally wouldn't think of. And maybe this will help some of you find more common ground, have less stupid arguments, and generally make more friends. And I think that's mostly this topic I wanted to talk about. Anyway, moving on.